had a false start on the recording because I was using the wrong microphone because I was doing a stewarding video. Anyways, let's get on to this UFC Fight Night Hermansen versus Strickland coming up this Saturday, February 5th, one day before my birthday. So the UFC gave me my birthday card, and it's not terrible. A lot of these fights individually are pretty interesting. You have a very relevant and competitive and interesting main event, Hermansen versus Sean Strickland. Obviously a good start. About as good as you're going to get for a fight night, which is fine. And then you have some interesting fights. Maximoff versus Carlson Harris. Sam Alvey versus Brendan Allen is about as interested and as invested as I'm going to get in a Sam Alvey fight. I do like Julian Erosa. I think that Miles John versus John Castaneda might be a lot better than a lot of people think. I'm interested in Dawadu versus Trisano. Chiji Nkwani's on the card, which is cool, although I think the matchmaking is a waste of him. I think Malcolm Gordon versus Dennis Bondar is actually a pretty interesting fight, and because of the shallowness of flyweight, is actually pretty relevant. So like there's a lot of fairly good stuff here. At the same time, as a card, it doesn't feel great. Could be that I just think Punaheli Soriano versus Nick Maximoff is kind of a garbage co-main event. One that I don't fully understand because I'm not really sure why the UFC would be playing nice with the Diaz brothers, but apparently they are. Man, I don't know. Maybe that's what's just sucking the life out of this. Because there are not many fights on this card that I'm just absolutely not looking forward to. There are a couple of exceptions. I'm not really looking forward to Alexis Davis versus Julia Storyalenko. I'm not really looking forward to Jason Witt versus Philip Rowe. I don't feel that that's actually UFC level. Like I said, the Chiji Nkwani fight feels like a complete waste of him. And then you've also got Brian Battle versus Treyshawn Gore, which is not particularly amazing. And then you have the Sam Alvey thing, which people have tried to argue that this is not the case, and it made some pretty decent points. But I'm left to believing that Sam Alvey has a job with the UFC because he's willing to work against fighters' best interests, whether he sees it that way or not. I'm not suggesting he's an evil man or anything, just his statements about fighter pay kind of work for the UFC's current pay model. And if you've ever watched any of my videos, you know I'm not a fan of that pay model. I am very tempted to do like a full video next time there's not a UFC card for a week on the topic and really explore it. Just because if nothing else, I'd like to have it to be able to reference in Twitter arguments. But that's kind of about all I have to say on that one. Anyways, so Alvey having a job, it never feels great. Anyways, just because of that. Let's start with the main event. Jack Hermansson coming off of winning against Edmund Shabazian, in which he endured some problems early, came back later. Before that, lost to Martin Vettori, had the quick win over Kelvin Gastelum, lost to Jared Cannonier. It's been a weird run for him since he beat Jacare Souza and kind of emerged as an elite fighter, because he followed that up immediately with the loss to Cannonier, and then there hasn't been a win that's shiny and interesting since then. I mean, a heel hook over Gastelum, that's cool. That's shiny, I guess, but it doesn't mean a ton. And then Sean Strickland, a guy whose career kind of for a while there looked kind of over. Not over, but plateaued. He's a guy who back in 2017, 2018, lost to Kamaru Usman, and Elijah Zaleski beat an aging out Court McGee. Kind of weird to say 5 years ago Court McGee was aging out, and he's still around. And a win over Nordin Taleb, which didn't mean a ton. And then he's kind of reinvigorated himself with a flyweight or a middleweight run from 2020 onwards, after having, I believe it was a motorcycle accident that put him out for a while, beating Jack Marshman, Brendan Allen, Christoph Yako, and Uriah Hall. Now, I'm going to say one thing. Two things about Strickland real quick. Number one is that Hermansen is better than the guys I just listed that he beat. But by the same token, stylistically, I think is very friendly to Strickland, in a way that none of those guys... I don't know if I want to say that, because Brendan Allen and Yako ask a lot of the same questions on a much lower scale. But by the same token, they don't have the flaw that I think Strickland capitalizes on against Hermansen. And what I'm getting at is that, historically, Hermansen, when he is shut down in the jab game, when he can't control that range boxing game and get the better of the jab, historically, it does not go very well. Sean Strickland is very good at that. By MMA standards, his jab is very educated, very solid, and it's really going through my brain is like, I can picture what a Hermansen win looks like. But it almost always comes back to watching Strickland flummox him in the range box game, probably eating a bunch of leg kicks because Strickland does not seemingly defend his body or his legs at all well. He has kind of like that sick jitsu mindset of that's a pussy thing to do. And as a result, you can score there quite frequently, but he will make you pay. And I just can't get past that, because Hermansen, not a super potent shot wrestler, a very good chain and clinch wrestler, but that's not how you get Sean Strickland down. This is a guy who flummoxed Kamaru Usman's takedowns pretty frequently and has never really been dominated in a wrestling grappling phase. Like, the way to beating him has been to out kickbox him like Santiago Ponzinibbio did. Out activity him. Make it chaotic. Usman did beat him by wrestling, but Usman is a freak, an amazing athlete. That's not quite what Hermansen is. And then Zaleski knocked him out through pure insanity. Spinning heel kick punches, according to Tapology. Like, to the point where I looked at that result and was like, you know what? That's not even applicable to this fight. Because Hermansen's way more structured, not as creative, not as chaotic with his striking. So I'm going to go with Strickland to win this fight. Hermansen, a guy who has been finished, but by notably more powerful one-hit punchers in Jared Cannonier and Thiago Santos. And that's the only two people who have finished him with strikes. He's been submitted a couple of times. Jason Butcher, Cesar Mutanche Ferreira. So I kind of think that Strickland, who's never really been the biggest finisher, whether at welterweight or middleweight, has only one finish at middleweight. I don't see him finishing him. So it's probably a unanimous decision win, where Strickland, despite his, and I'm using his words here, white trash crazy fucker persona, wins this fight through a methodical breakdown of the range boxing game, which is weird. If there's anyone whose fighting style doesn't really suit their personality, it might be Sean Strickland, because Sean Strickland is, if we're being entirely honest, kind of a crazy psychopath. But he doesn't really fight like it. It's a bit weird. Oh, Nick Maximoff versus Punaheli Soriano. I am going with Soriano. I think that Maximoff has a tremendous ceiling. I think the athletic ability, the baseline toughness, the grappling chops, the wrestling game, these are all good enough to be a top level middleweight. The problem for him is, the way I see it, twofold. Number one is his coaching situation. He's a Nick Diaz Academy fighter. He trains on the Diaz brothers pretty closely. And while training under the Diaz brothers, you would think would be a good thing. They're two very, very good fighters. There should be a lot to gain from that. The problem tends to be that the way the Diaz's fight is so Diaz, for lack of a better word, that when you're dealing with trying to replicate that style, you have to have the Diaz intangibles, and if you don't, I don't think it'll work very well. And I don't really think many people have the Diaz intangibles, that psychotic confidence, that willingness, except for, I guess, kind of recently with Nick, to go to a place that really hurts, to really, really not enjoy what you're doing and still do it well. And I don't think that Maximoff is that guy. I don't think many people are that guy. The Diaz brothers are not people I'd recommend training under. And the second problem is that Maximoff's game is, I often will say, when describing a fighter, that their game is disjointed. Like, one phase doesn't lead to the other phase. The connective tissue is broken. Maximoff is stunningly the case with that, to a level I don't think I've seen in the UFC in a while, at least, where his comfort as a wrestler and to a degree as a grappler is from a completely different stance than his comfort as a boxer and striker. That means that he's one-dimensional depending on what stance he's in. He has to switch stances to switch phases of the game. And I don't think anything is more disjointed than that. If he ever solves that, I think he's a dangerous fighter. Like I said, I think all the prerequisites are there for a good middleweight. I just don't think that he can put it together. Also, there's a picture of him standing beside the two Diaz brothers here that I'm staring at. And he's supposed to be 6 feet tall. Diaz's, of course, are like often quoted at like 5'10", 5'11". They are taller than him. So, once again, don't trust the UFC's height stuff. And I've talked incredibly little about Soriano for a guy that I'm picking to win this fight, probably by TKO. But Soriano hits really hard. He wrestles actually pretty well. The path to beating him, generally speaking, is not going to be wrestling. He's a guy who's lost once in his career. Yes, he lost to Brendan Allen, and part of that was takedowns, part of that was scrambles, part of that was grappling. These are all things that that Maximoff does well, but Allen has a much more connected game, striking to grappling, much more blended game, much more veteran game, which makes sense because that was Brendan Allen's 21st fight, and Maximoff has had 7. That is completely lacking, and I think Soriano, when asked one question at a time, will solve them, will be the better striker, will be a good enough wrestler to keep this standing. or if it does go to the ground, a good enough scrambler to survive, get back to his feet, and eventually club Maximoff over the head. But it's not a fight that I'm super intrigued by because I think that a slower progression of Maximoff would be much more interesting. I think if you're elevating him into the middle of 185 when he is, in my opinion, not ready, it's going to lead to problems. I am very interested in the next fight, which is Shavkat Rakhmonov, who has beaten Alex Oliveira and Michel Prazeres in his UFC run against Carlston Harris, who I wasn't big on when he came in, but has shown up very well and beaten Christian Aguilera and Impa Kasanganay. To a degree, these two fighters are very, very similar in the sense that they're coming from regional scenes where they were the big bad. They were the physical freak, the specimen, the destroyer of worlds. And both of their styles are based on that. They're based on being stronger, being more potent, being something to be afraid of. And in Rakhmonov's case, I think he's come to the UFC and that has remained pretty much intact because Alex Oliveira is kind of that kind of guy. Carlston Harris, it's not gone for sure. Christian Aguilera and Impa Kasanganay are not, by any stretch of the imagination, bad physical specimens of fighter. But in Kasanganay's case, he is a guy getting used to a new weight class that hasn't seemed to have gone well for him because he came in as a middleweight. And in the case of Aguilera, there's a lot of holes in that game. And there's a lot of holes in Kasanganay's game as well. And it's not that there's not holes in Rakhmonov's game. It's just that I think Rakhmonov has answered the question of, does his physicality translate to the UFC without losing a step? And in Harris, I'm not 100% convinced that's happened. Also, I've been talking about them being very similar, but I think Rakhmonov's game is, despite the fact that it is based on physicality and based on being the big bad, is a pretty well put together game. It's just kind of aggressive on the counter at all times, and that at some point will run him into trouble. Whereas Carlston Harris's game, it feels like the big bad game. It feels like I have not developed the technical depth in a lot of areas. I'm very wild, very unstructured, and I make up for that with athleticism that Rakhmonov doesn't quite have to the same degree. And I think Rakhmonov has shown a schooled approach that he comes into a fight with a couple of answers, a couple of counters he wants to go to, that he is drilled basically to fight that fighter. And it's not something I really think I've seen from Harris. Harris is going to approach more or less any fight the same way. This is why I'm taking Rakhmonov to basically catch a counter at some point against Carlston Harris and put him down. Probably club and sub is more likely than actual TKO KO finish because Harris has been finished once, and despite having beaten some guys who are notably heavy hitters, Michel Pereira comes to mind specifically. I don't know. I'm going to say TKO KO for Rakhmonov. It's a really interesting fight. It's the exact fight that I think both of these guys probably could need. Like, it's good matchmaking. Whereas I don't love the main event matchmaking, and I hate the co-main event matchmaking. This one's pretty well done. Speaking of good matchmaking, if you're going to book Sam Alvey, who has lost 1, 2, 3, 6 of his last 7 fights with a draw to Dawadu as the lone one. Has not won since 2018 split decision against Gian Vellante. And going to split decision with Gian Vellante is not exactly great. And hasn't had a convincing win since 2018 when he knocked out a glass cannon Marcin Prachnio. I mean, I guess this is it. It's kind of weird that this is also the 3rd fight Alvy's been booked on for this card. Initially, it was supposed to be Ian Heinisch, which seems like a real fall down the aisle for Heinisch. And then it was supposed to be Phil Hawes. Now it's Brendan Allen. What do I like about this fight? Well, the big problem with Sam Alvey and what makes him painful to watch for me is that he's such a dedicated counterfighter. Well, honestly, what frustrates me about Sam Alvey, probably more than anything else, is actually his reaction to decisions. Just because he's lost basically slight variations of the same fight 6 times in the last 7 out, and still has the audacity, the courage, some I guess would call it, to be to actually question a decision, to be angry about it, when it's like, that is that's the fight we knew you were going to have, and that you were going to lose, and you didn't adjust to do anything different. And that is his very counter-based, pretty low output game. Like, there's some good things about him. He's incredibly hard to take down. He still has reasonably good power. His counter accuracy is actually pretty good. His timing is pretty good. But the game plan and the book on how to beat Sam Alvey has been so well written at this point that I don't think any other fighter in existence can even say it. Like, this is, you could write a textbook. Here's how to beat Sam Alvey. Brendan Allen, honestly, is not normally the guy to fight the manner. He is aggressive. He will go into counters. He will try to wrestle and try to provoke scrambles. Coming off a loss to Chris Curtis in a fight that he was winning up until the point where he got knocked out, which is just, it's a Chris Curtis fight. Before that, beat Punaheli Soriano, beat Carl Roberson, lost to Sean Strickland. So actually a lot of connections to this card. Victories over Kyle Dockhouse, Tom Breeze, Kevin Holland are still probably the highlights of his UFC run so far. I'm going to take Allen because I don't think I'm going to take Sam Alvey to win a fight, period. You could argue that Allen's coming up to 205 for this fight, so that's a problem. That being said, I think it's 205 just so that he can take this on short notice. Alvey's also not really a 205er. There is this random shiny spot in my beard. I cannot, for the life of me, figure out what it is. Looks like there's something stuck in there, like a piece of food or something. But whatever it is, I don't know. I think it's just a really lightly colored part of my hair. Anyways, taking Brendan Allen because, like I said, I can't trust Sam Alvey. I can't. Decision. Probably a split. That Alvey is stunned. He lost. Brian Battle versus Treyshawn Gore. This was supposed to be the final of the Ultimate Fighter, which Brian Battle won over Gore. It's kind of a weird one in the sense that Gore is the one that I feel way better about long term. Seems very athletic. Seems like he hits hard. Explosive. Athlete. All the Joe Rogan black descriptions. And in Battle's case, I don't really sense anything terribly dominant about him. I think that he beat someone in Gilbert Urbina who was just not UFC caliber. I feel the same about pretty much all of his wins because the man's pro wins before the UFC. The 5 of them have a combined 5 wins coming in. I don't know any of them. So it's a tough sell that he's really got much. Now, he does have amateur wins over Cody Brundage, who's not a terrible fighter, and Impa Kasanganai, who's a pretty reasonable fighter. Both by decision, split in the case of Brundage. I've not seen those fights, so it's hard to take a ton from it, but it does indicate that he probably can compete on an athletic level, even though it doesn't feel like he should be able to. But I also just don't think Gore is ready for this level of competition. And to be clear, I don't think many 3-0 fighters are. This was kind of a weird case where someone went on a run through the Ultimate Fighter without, to my knowledge, a really deep wrestling or boxing or kickboxing or BJJ background. And he's also a guy with one stoppage, despite probably being power punching being his best option. And I don't really look at the Ultimate Fighter House results as anything predictive, because the way to get through the Ultimate Fighter House is to just have a style that kind of suits fighting anyone without tremendously deep prep, because you're not going to get it just over the time period in there. And being able probably to take advantage of some of the good coaching, stay healthy is a big thing, and making a run, because there's a number of guys who have made good runs through the Ultimate Fighter House and then really have stunk it up in the long term as pro fighters. I am going to go with Battle to win a decision here. He fights well from behind, so even if Gore comes out and is athletically imposing, physically advantaged, I think Battle has the mindset to come back from that and do what he can do. But I also do believe Gore probably is the better fighter in the long run. Julian Rosa, Steven Peterson. I'm calling this the quadruple A fight because these are two guys that I can never fully believe are UFC caliber. In Rosa's case, it's just too many stoppage losses. His first run through the UFC way back after his Ultimate Fighter run in 2015, where he went 1-1, losing to Teruto Ishihara. Ishihara's just not that good. Went on the circuit where he lost to Bobby McIntyre and Paddy Pimblett. I still don't really think that much of Pimblett. I know a lot of people do. I just don't. Beat Jamal Emmers on the Contender Series. Very good win. Lost 3 in a row in the UFC. It's good fighters. Devontae Smith, Grant Dawson, Julio Arce. All pretty good fighters. Came back. Surprised Sean Woodson. Beat Nate Lamware. Lost to Suhui Choi. And recently beat Charles Jourdain, which is a fight I didn't think he would win. So maybe the quadruple A is finally wearing off for him. Peterson kind of wins fights off of just being willing to grind, being extremely tough, and just kind of drowning his opponents in a manner of like, why won't you die? And I don't think you really can you can take Erosa that way. You know, the big win over Chase Hooper, but losing to Martin Bravo until he won. Barely beating Matt Bissett. Losing to Alex Caceres and Violent Bob Ross. Losing to Brandon Davis. Like, it's not been a great 6-fight run. Like, he's 3-3, but the 3 losses are like, Pena's not in the UFC, admittedly, for reasons outside the cage. I don't think Brandon Davis is in the UFC anymore. I could be wrong. Brandon Davis did fight in the UFC in his last fight. Oh, he definitely did get cut, though, because he took 4 fights in Gulf Coast MMA. So, okay, so he got cut and he came back. Right. And his UFC run, despite being much hyped off of the Contender Series where he beat Austin Arnett, not amazing. lost to Kyle Bochniak, beat Peterson, lost to Barzola, lost to Zabit Magomed Sharapov, beat Randy Costa, lost to Kwan Ho Kang, lost to Giga Chikadze. So not a great run. And then lost to Danam Batcherel most recently. I don't really see how Peterson wins the fight. So I have to go with Erosa. Either by decision or by some kind of club and sub or maybe a knockout. Like Erosa's a potent finisher. Peterson's not unfinishable despite being pretty damn tough. But I'm going to go with Erosa. Decision. Miles Johns versus John Castaneda. I'm very interested in this fight. On one hand, I never really think of John Castaneda as a good wrestler, but he's out of the academy in Minnesota, which, if I'm not mistaken, is Greg Nelson's gym. Yes, it is. Greg Nelson. And you got Brock Larson, you got the GOAT. Sean Shirk used to train out of there. I don't think he has any connection with the gym now. Jacob Volkman is there. Logan Clark is there. So, I mean, there's not a lot of, like, current up-and-comers in the UFC from that gym, but it's definitely a good gym for wrestling purposes. And Castaneda has been a better wrestler than I probably give him credit for. 2-1 in the UFC so far, beating Marcelo Rojo and the ghost of Eddie Wineland, and losing to Nathaniel Wood, who's a very good fighter. Part of me wants to say that Miles Johns still is just too good of a physical fighter, but part of me also wants to say Miles Johns is really not put together that well. What I mean by this is that Miles Johns is really willing to give up the initiative in a fight because he's kind of gone away from his wrestling game, and his stand-up game is this kind of weird counter game that he's not really composed enough or really good enough at timing to really pull off. It's one of those things where I'm not sure who's he training with. Fortis MMA? Interesting, because it's a very non-Fortis MMA style. It's always a bit weird sometimes to see where people come from. I guess with both of them, because, I mean, Castaneda does not have a Wrestling Force Minnesota Academy style, and Miles Johns doesn't really have the typical Fortis style. So I worry about it, but, like, all the requirements are there. Johns does have a good wrestling game. Johns does have a good power striking game. Johns is a good athlete. He is explosive. He does hit hard. So, like, everything is there. Just I feel like he's being put together in somewhat the wrong manner. He's spending his development points in the wrong spots, trying to develop a style that I don't think is optimal for him. And Castaneda definitely could take advantage of that. He is a good combination puncher. He is a guy who, if you let him pressure you, is going to do some very good things with it. But at the same time, I can't get over the idea that I think Miles Johns just is too good of an athlete for Castaneda to beat in that manner. And that Castaneda has faced this sort of test before, and it's not necessarily gone his way. I don't know who that would be. Looking at his record, I can't remember where I developed that thought, but at some point I did, and I can't shake it. So I'm picking Miles Johns to win by decision. That being said, I could totally see Castaneda winning this fight, and I also feel like I have a read that I cannot necessarily back up when it comes to John Castaneda. So take that with a grain of salt. Hakim Dawadu versus Mike Trisano. I feel like Trisano is a fighter who's developing a pretty good style. This jab-heavy range boxing style, backed up with some wrestling and some willingness to grapple and some good scrambling. But I also feel that if you're looking to have a volume striking match, essentially with Hakim Dawadu, that's not the way to beat him. There's a lot of ways to beat Hakim Dawadu. I think there's some definite deficiencies in his wrestling game. I think there's some deficiencies in his grappling. I think there's some overconfidence issues. in his game that can lead to him getting caught. I just don't see Trisano bringing in a lot of that, because as much as Trisano is, I think, the better grappler and the better wrestler, he's not, like, that's not his game. That's not how he's developed. He's a willing grappler, a willing wrestler. But it's usually if you want to wrestle him. And Dawadu shouldn't, put it that way. And if it's just a kickboxing match, there's not a lot of featherweights I'm picking to beat Hakim Dawadu in just a strict blow-for-flow match, unless they have big knockout power or a extensive grappling background. So I'm taking Dawadu to win a decision. Marc-Andre Barrio, Chidi Njokuani. I'm pretty excited to see Chidi Njokuani in the UFC. I've always been a pretty big fan of his. I think he has a lot of good things to offer. I think he has immense potential as an action fighter. Guy who was in Bellator for a really long time, had some good wins, had some losses too, to guys like John Salter and Korshkov and Rafael Carvalho. Has a fight with Jeremy Kimball way back in the day. I kind of want to go back and watch that. It's not probative to this fight, but just, I don't know, that in my head is a very interesting matchup. But the problem is I think he is a guy who can be pressured by someone tough and with a multi-dimensional pressure game and made kind of boring. And that kind of is Barrio. He's an aggressive pressure fighter who will mix in stalling clinch work with kind of ugly looking but surprisingly effective boxing. And a never-ending gas tank. So I like Barrio. I've actually met Marc-Andre Barrio. Probably doesn't remember me in any way, but he made a very good impression on me, like as a person and just as a fighter. There's nothing super amazing or impressive about him. He came into the UFC, lost 3 in a row to Sanchez, Yatko, and Jin Park. And then since then, had the no contest with Oscar Piotr. What was the deal with that fight? Because it's uppercuts and ground pound, so it looks like somebody won the fight. Let's have a look here. And then what happened? Someone popped for the PEDs. Yeah, he tested positive for Osterine after beating Piotr. All right. And then beat Abu Zaitar and Dolce Luyambula, who is not Chidi. Chidi's a better fighter of that, but I think is a more physically imposing version of what Chidi is, while Chidi is a more technical version of it. I just don't think Barrio's going to be terribly afraid of it, and he's going to go into the buzzsaw, so to speak, put the pressure on, probably cage and stall a fair bit, and probably come out with a decision. Alexis Davis should beat Julia Storyalenko. I'm not interested in this fight. Storyalenko is a fighter who got to the UFC with a style that should not have worked. It was a pull guard armbar style, essentially. She is, I think, fairly big, although 5'7" is not especially tall. She just doesn't bring anything that Alexis Davis historically struggles with. I mean, the fight is interesting in the sense that Alexis Davis at 37 years old is like, you know, on the downturn and may go sharply into a downturn from a physical standpoint, but has shown that the toughness is still there. She hasn't been finished by strikes since Ronda Rousey in 2014. She was submitted by Sarah McMahon, but Sarah McMahon by arm triangle, that's not a bad thing. She is... I don't want to be in a Sarah McMahon arm triangle, just saying. There's a lot of squeeze there. Like losing to Caitlin Chikagi and Jennifer Maia, Viviana Rougeau, and Penny Keenzad, they're all way better put together fighters than Stolyarenko. Davis, decision. She doesn't really finish people all that often, so I don't see her finishing her. Jailton Almeida versus Danilo Marquez. This is a weird fight in a lot of ways because I'm a little bit high on Almeida. But I'm high on Almeida after seeing him fight once. The Brazilian regional scene is just not something I ever pay super close attention to. It's where both of these guys are from. And in the case of Almeida, this means I've really just seen his Dana White's Contender Series fight. And he looked good in that. He looked powerful. He looked like he had a good grappling game, good back take game. A little bit more than the standard Brazilian I wrestle on a scene that doesn't have a lot of wrestling. Physically imposing. And I've just never been impressed with Marquez. I'm not saying that there's nothing to Marquez. He has a good back take game. If he's on your back, you're in trouble. But he's not a super active grappler anywhere else. His striking is unimpressive. And he's not super physically impressive either. And Almeida is. So I'm going with Almeida, but I hesitate to say that it is a good idea to bet money on this fight or take this very seriously because I am basing it off of tremendously little data. It's a lot less data than I would like to, but I also don't feel like going super deep into this fight either. So I'm going with Almeida. I'm going to say by submission, probably. I think he ends up on Marquez's back at some point. Probably. And like Marquez has been fine. He beat Mike Rodriguez. That's a good win. He beat Kadis Bragimov. That's not as good of a win. And the loss to Kennedy Njoku is kind of aging poorly, even though Kennedy's only fought once since and losing to Daun Jung. But like, wasn't very good. They're booking Kennedy against Nick Neckemar. Why? One of those fighters is like heading to bigger and better things, it feels like, and one is kind of dead in the water. Why book that fight? Whatever. Jason Witt versus Philip Rowe. Not really impressed with either guy. Rowe's a good power puncher. Doesn't seem to be a lot to his game. There's a fair amount of athleticism in there. Not been super active. We'll go with Witt. I mean, Witt is your bare bones wrestle boxer. It's just that I think that that's probably sufficient. And then an interesting fight to open up the card at flyweight. Malcolm Gordon, Dennis Bondar. I'm picking Bondar, but I also have a hesitancy with Bondar because he is a can opener. We've not seen him, or can crusher, I should say. He's not a guy who has fought a lot against high-level competition. In fact, not at all. But everything in his game seems well put together. The athleticism seems to be there. And Malcolm Gordon is tremendously fragile, I think is what it comes down to. I don't know if I can ever really trust Malcolm Gordon in a fight because I've seen him hurt so many times. And while his resume is better than Bondar's, yes, beating Francisco Figueiredo and Yanni Sherbatov, and that's about it. Chris Kalades, way back in the day, is a better resume than what Bondar has put together. But at the same time, he's lost to Randy Turner, Austin Ryan, Dimitri Wardenberg, Amir Albazi, and Sue Mujari in ways, with the exception of the last two, that I could definitely see Bondar beating Malcolm Gordon in. So I picked the Canadians earlier in the card with Dawadu, Barrio, and Davis all getting my pick. I can't pick all the Canadians on the card and feel like I'm not getting some national bias in there. So I am picking against Malcolm Gordon. I just too fragile. Don't get me wrong. I love what he's put together. It's a creative, exciting style. I really like it, but there is just too much physical problem there. So Bondar probably getting a takedown at some point and ground and pounding his way to victory is probably my guess. Might hurt him on the feet as well. It's just a shame. It's one of those. This is one of those cases where, like, I feel like the athletic portions of Gordon's game are there. I feel like the creativity, the mentality, it's there. I just feel like he's too fragile to really trust against anyone with a reasonably high level of physicality and a reasonably high level of power. And I think Bondar has both of those things. We'll find out, though. Like I said, Bondar has been a can crusher. This is, I think, by far his best fight. Best fighter he's faced. Just looking over his record here really quickly. There's a couple of people that pop up with, like, okay records, like Kawan Jacques. But I've also never really seen that. I've never seen him fight. And then, of course, he has 2 losses to Alexander Lunga, who is a pretty decent fighter, but I'm not sure how much you can really derive from losing to a reasonable fighter. And the last of those fights was 5 years ago. So, that's the card. It's a card that's worth watching. But at the same time, it does mark the kind of downturn of UFC fight card quality. I know someone's going to be like, it's still better than anything else. There are very few fights on here that wouldn't feel right at home on an LFA card or a, like, even before the Bellator main event or like a 1FC card. Like, they all feel like they could easily be there. And that's something the UFC didn't used to have. It used to be that the UFC would have a bunch of fights, even on a free card, even on a Spike fight night or an FS1 fight night, that there would be a 4 or 5 half dozen fights that were very UFC. And this card really just has Hermansen versus Strickland. That's the only one that feels like a UFC fight. I guess Sam Alvey, just because he's been here forever, feels like a UFC fight. It shouldn't. There are a lot of regional fighters I think would beat Sam Alvey. So I don't know. It doesn't feel like a tremendously great UFC fight card. It might deliver. Like I said, there's interesting stuff here. I'm really looking forward to Harris versus Rachmanov. I think that's going to be all sorts of crazy and interesting. I'm interested to see if Miles Johns can prove me right or John Castaneda can prove me wrong. I'm interested in Jailton and Almeida in the long term. I'm interested in Dennis Bondar in the long term. But I'm also not especially interested in their fights because I think that they're both fights of confirmation rather than learning. And there are just some kind of, I don't like them fights like Witt versus Rowe, Davis versus Stolyarenko, Barrio versus Njokwani, an example of 2 fighters I like, but I don't like paired together. And I don't really love the Dawadu Trisano fight. I think it's confusing matchmaking. I think Alvey versus Allen will probably suck. And I just don't like how they're handling Nick Maximoff. There you go. Another one to throw into the bag of the billions for the UFC pay-per-view and entertainment machine.